The rain hammered against the windshield of Sarah Martinez's unmarked sedan as she pulled into the cracked parking lot of Romano's restaurant. The neon sign flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows across the puddles that had formed in the broken asphalt. She checked her watch. 9:47 p.m. 13 minutes early, exactly as she'd planned. In undercover work, timing was everything, and Detective Martinez had learned to calculate every variable that could mean the difference between life and death. She studied the building through her rain-streaked windshield. Romano's had been a legitimate Italian restaurant once, back when this part of downtown still held promise. Now it served as a front for money laundering operations. Its dining room empty most nights, except for the occasional business meeting in the back rooms. The kind of meetings where men in expensive suits discussed shipments that never appeared on any manifest, and where questions about missing persons were met with uncomfortable silence. Sarah adjusted the rearview mirror, scanning the street. Behind her, a black Escalade sat parked under a broken streetlight. 3 blocks back, the same vehicle she'd noticed following her intermittently over the past week. They were getting sloppy, or perhaps they wanted her to know she was being watched. Either way, it meant tonight's meeting with her supposed informant, Miguel Santos, was likely compromised. She'd suspected as much when he'd suddenly requested. The location changed from their usual neutral ground at the pier. The detective reached into her worn leather purse, fingers brushing against cold metal. The familiar weight of her father's Desert Eagle provided a measure of comfort, though she hoped she wouldn't need it tonight. Her backup team was positioned 6 blocks away, close enough to respond to trouble, but far enough to maintain her cover. At least, that was the plan. In her 3 years working undercover in the Rodriguez cartel's organization, she'd learned that plans had a way of falling apart when real bullets started flying. A text message buzzed on her burner phone. 2nd floor, back room. Come alone. Ma'am Sarah Martinez took a deep breath, gathering herself for what she knew could be her final performance. For 8 months, she'd carefully built the identity of Sofia Restrepo, a corrupt customs officer willing to look the other way for the right price. She'd memorized every detail of Sofia's fabricated history: a childhood in Bogotá, a sick mother needing expensive medical treatment, a bitter divorce that left her desperate for money. The FBI's behavioral analysts had crafted the perfect profile of someone Carlos Rodriguez would trust, someone whose greed matched his own. She stepped out of the car, immediately feeling the October chill cut through her leather jacket. The rain had softened to a steady drizzle, but the wind carried the scent of decay from the nearby industrial district. This part of the city died. After dark, when the legitimate businesses closed and the shadows came alive with activities that thrived in darkness, it was perfect territory for a man like Carlos Rodriguez, isolated, controllable, forgotten by the authorities who preferred to patrol safer neighborhoods. The restaurant's front door stood slightly ajar, revealing a darkened dining room where plastic chairs sat stacked on tables like sleeping sentries. Sarah pushed inside, her heels clicking against cracked tile that had once been white but now bore the stains of years of neglect. The air hung thick with the smell of old grease and cigarette smoke, underlaid with something else, the metallic scent of fear that seemed to permeate places where violence was commonplace. "Sofia?" A voice called from somewhere in the darkness. "This way." She followed the sound up a narrow staircase, each step creaking under her weight. The walls were covered in faded photographs of better days, images of Romano's grand opening in 1987, pictures of the original owner shaking hands with local politicians who are probably dead or imprisoned by now. At the top of the stairs, a dim hallway stretched toward a door marked with peeling paint that might once have read, "Private." Sarah's instincts screamed warnings as she approached the door. The silence was too complete, too orchestrated. In her months of dealing with Miguel Santos, Their meetings had always been hurried affairs in public spaces, parking garages, shopping malls, places where their conversations could blend into the ambient noise of normal life. This felt different. This felt like a trap. But she'd come too far to turn back now. The Rodriguez investigation represented 3 years of her life, dozens of federal agents' work, and the hope of dismantling one of the most sophisticated drug trafficking operations on the West Coast. If Miguel had truly turned against her, if her cover was blown, she needed to know how deep the compromise went. Too many other agents' lives depended on that information. She pushed open the door and stepped into Romano's back room. The space was larger than she'd expected, with a long wooden table dominating the center and chairs arranged around it, like some kind of boardroom from hell. Harsh fluorescent lighting hummed overhead, casting everything in sickly green tones. The windows had been painted black years ago, sealing the room off from the outside world. 6 men sat around the table, their faces turning toward her in unison, like predators who'd been waiting for prey to wander into their territory. Sarah's blood turned to ice as she recognized the face at the head of the table, not Miguel Santos, but Carlos Rodriguez himself, the man she'd spent months trying to get close to, the target of their entire operation, sat studying her with eyes that held no warmth, no recognition of their carefully cultivated business relationship. "Sit down, detective," Carlos said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "We have so much to discuss." The door clicked shut behind her with the finality of a coffin lid, and Sarah Martinez realized that everything she thought she knew about this investigation had just changed forever. Sarah forced herself to remain calm as she absorbed the implications of Carlos Rodriguez's words. Detective, not Sophia, not the carefully crafted identity she'd spent 8 months building. Her real name, her real profession, spoken with the casual confidence of a man who held all the cards. She could feel the weight of 6 pairs of eyes studying her every micro-expression, searching for fear, for weakness, for any crack in the composure that had kept her alive this long. "I think you have me confused with someone else," she said, lowering herself slowly into the indicated chair. Her voice carried just the right note of bewilderment mixed with indignation, the reaction Sofia Restrepo would have to such an accusation. Even now, with her cover blown, the performance had to continue. It was the only thing standing between her and a shallow grave in the desert. Carlos Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, a predator savoring the moment before the kill. At 52, he'd built his empire through a combination of brutal violence and strategic patience. His expensive suit couldn't quite hide the prison tattoos that covered his forearms, remnants of his younger days when he'd earned his reputation with a knife, rather than a boardroom. The scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, a souvenir from a rival cartel's assassination attempt, pulled his face into a permanent sneer. "Sofia Restrepo," he said, drawing out each syllable like a curse. "Customs officer. From San Pedro, divorced. Mother with kidney disease in Colombia. Such a touching story." He gestured to one of his lieutenants, a mountain of muscle named Torres, who served as his enforcer. "Show our guest what we know." Torres slid a manila folder across the scarred wooden table. Sarah's hands remained steady as she opened it, though. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. Inside were surveillance photographs, dozens of them. Images of her meeting with FBI handlers in parking garages. Photos of her entering the federal building downtown. A picture of her shaking hands with Special Agent Morrison, the man who'd recruited her for this operation. But it was the final photograph that made her blood run cold. It showed her standing beside her father's grave at Arlington National Cemetery, laying a wreath on Memorial Day 6 months ago. Someone had been watching her even then, documenting her real life, while she thought she was safely maintaining her cover. Detective Sarah Martinez, Carlos continued, his voice taking on a mocking tone. 12 years LAPD, 3 years undercover work. Father killed in the line of duty when she was 16. He leaned forward, his dark eyes boring into hers. Tell me, detective, did you really think we were stupid enough to trust a woman who appeared in our organization exactly when the heat from federal investigators started increasing? The room seemed to shrink around her as the implications became clear. This wasn't just about a blown cover. This was about a systematic counterintelligence operation. The Rodriguez cartel had been watching her from the beginning, possibly feeding her information they wanted the FBI to have while conducting their real business through channels she'd never even suspected existed. Miguel Santos doesn't exist, Carlos said, answering the question she hadn't dared to ask. We created him. Every meeting, every piece of information he fed you, every detail about our operations, all carefully crafted fiction. We wanted to see how deep the federal investigation went, how many agents were involved, what methods you were using. Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. 3 years of her life, dozens of cases built on information from Miguel. Entire prosecutions that had seemed like victories, all of it orchestrated by the very criminals they'd thought they were hunting. The scope of the deception was staggering. But the real question, Carlos continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting, is what our inside source told us about your backup protocols. About how long? We have before your federal friends come looking for you. Inside source. The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Someone within law enforcement was feeding information to the Rodriguez cartel. Not just about her operation, but about federal procedures, backup protocols, response times. The betrayal ran deeper than a blown cover. It compromised every federal operation against organized crime in the region. 22 minutes, said a voice from the corner of the room. Sarah turned to see a figure step out of the shadows. Man in his 40s, wearing a rumpled FBI windbreaker. Special Agent David Chun, a 15-year veteran of the Bureau, who'd been part of her support team since the operation began. The man who knew her real identity, her backup schedules, her emergency protocols. Agent Chun has been very helpful, Carlos said, genuine warmth creeping into his voice for the first time. Amazing what gambling debts and a sick child can motivate a man to do. He's been keeping us informed about federal investigations for over 2 years now. Sarah stared at Chun, trying to process the magnitude of his betrayal. How many operations had been compromised? How many agents had died because of information he'd sold? The man she'd trusted with her life had been systematically destroying everything she'd worked for. The beauty of it, Carlos continued, is that your backup team thinks you're in a routine meeting with an informant. They won't expect contact for another hour. By then, Detective Martinez will have simply disappeared, another casualty of undercover work gone wrong. These things happen in your line of work. He stood up, his men rising with him in synchronized motion. You cost us $20 million in shipments over the past year, Detective. Operations we had to shut down, routes we had to abandon, people we had to relocate. All based on the intelligence you thought you were gathering. But every loss was calculated, every sacrifice planned. We gave up small pieces to protect the whole, and now it's time to collect our compensation. The fluorescent light above flickered ominously, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Sarah realized with crystalline clarity that she was about to die in this forgotten room, betrayed by the very system she'd devoted her life to protecting. But she wasn't dead yet, and as long as her heart was still beating, she had options. She just had to stay alive long enough to find them. Part 3. The setup unfolds, expanded. Sarah's mind raced through her tactical options as Carlos circled the table like a shark scenting blood in the water. The room's layout worked against her. Only one exit, 6 armed men between her and freedom. windows painted black that offered no escape route. But 12 years of police work and 3 years of deep cover operations had taught her that survival often came down to controlling the narrative, even when the odds were stacked impossibly. Hi. You know what I find most amusing about federal agents? Carlos asked, his polished leather shoes clicking against the worn linoleum with each measured step. You're so concerned with gathering evidence, building cases, following procedures. You forget that the people you're hunting have been playing this game their entire lives. He paused behind her chair, close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne mixed with the metallic scent of gun oil. We don't need warrants. We don't need probable cause. We just need results. The other men in the room shifted restlessly, their hands moving toward concealed weapons with the practiced ease of predators who'd done this dance many times before. Sarah recognized the type career criminals who'd graduated from street level, dealing to the sophisticated machinery of international drug trafficking. These weren't desperate junkies or impulsive gang members. They were professionals who understood that violence was simply another business tool, no different from accounting or logistics. Torres, a massive enforcer who'd shown her the photographs, cracked his knuckles with sounds like breaking branches. Want me to search her, Hefe? His voice carried the casual indifference of a man who'd performed such searches countless times, usually as prelude to disposing of the body afterward. Patience, my friend, Carlos replied, though his smile held no warmth. Our detective friend here needs to understand the full scope of her situation before we proceed. You see, Sarah May, I call you Sarah? This isn't just about punishing you for your interference. This is about sending a message to every federal agent who thinks they can infiltrate our organization. Special Agent Chun cleared his throat. From his position near the door, his face a mask of guilt and resignation. Carlos, we should move quickly. The backup protocols will proceed exactly as you've described them to us, Carlos finished. Your colleagues believe Detective Martinez is meeting with a reliable informant in a secure location. They have no reason to suspect trouble until she fails to check in at midnight. That gives us nearly 2 hours to conclude our business and arrange her disappearance. Sarah forced herself to maintain eye contact with Carlos, refusing to show the fear that threatened to overwhelm her tactical thinking. You're making a mistake, she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Kill a federal agent, and you'll have every law enforcement agency in the eye, country hunting you. The heat will never stop. Carlos laughed, a sound like breaking glass that echoed off the painted-over windows. Oh, my dear detective, you still don't understand. You're not going to be killed here tonight. That would be crude, obvious, likely, to generate exactly the kind of attention you describe. He returned to his seat at the head of the table, steepling his fingers like a professor delivering a lecture. No, you're going to simply vanish. Another undercover agent who got in too deep, made too many enemies, perhaps skimmed a little money from evidence lockers to support a secret drug habit. The psychological warfare was as calculated as everything else about this operation. Carlos was destroying her mentally before moving to the physical phase, eroding her confidence and hope with each revelation of how thoroughly they planned her destruction. It was a technique she'd seen used on suspects during interrogations, but experiencing it from the victim's perspective was entirely different. Agent Chun has been very helpful in creating your psychological profile for our purposes, Carlos continued. A dedicated officer struggling with the stress of deep cover work, financial problems from her father's medical bills before his death, romantic entanglements with criminals she was supposed to be investigating. Amazing how easy it is to construct a narrative of corruption when you have access to federal personnel files. Sarah felt the walls closing in as she realized the full scope of their plan. They weren't just going to kill her. They were going to destroy her reputation, her legacy, everything she'd worked for. Her father's memory would be tainted by association with a daughter portrayed as a corrupt cop who'd gotten in over her head. "But first," Carlos said, his tone shifting from conversational to menacing, "we need to ensure you're not carrying any surveillance equipment that might complicate our narrative. Strip search protocols, you understand. Very thorough. Very ... comprehensive." Torres stood up from his chair, his massive frame blocking the overhead light and casting Sarah's section of the table into shadow. She could be wearing a wire, carrying recording devices, maybe even have GPS tracking embedded in her clothing or jewelry. "We need to be very careful, very complete in our examination." The implied threat hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Sarah had endured worse situations during her military training, survived hostile interrogations during war games, but this felt different. This was personal, calculated humiliation designed to break her psychologically before they moved to the final phase of their plan. "Empty your purse first," Carlos commanded, gesturing toward her worn leather bag. "Let's see what tools of the trade our federal friend carries when she thinks she's meeting a friendly informant." Torres moved around the table with surprising grace for such a large man, his intentions clear in the predatory smile that played across his scarred features. Sarah knew that the next few minutes would determine whether she lived to see another sunrise, whether her father's legacy would survive intact, whether the federal agents counting on her would ever learn how deeply their operations had been compromised. She also knew that her worn leather purse contained more than just the standard equipment of an undercover detective. Hidden beneath false compartments and wrapped in protective cloth lay the one thing. Carlos Rodriguez and his professional killers weren't expecting a reminder that some legacies run deeper than any cover story, some traditions stronger than any criminal organization. The golden desert eagle waited in darkness, carrying with it the promise of a reckoning that would change everything in the blood-stained room above Romano's restaurant. Torres's massive hands seized Sarah's worn leather purse with the casual brutality of a man who'd performed similar searches on countless victims. The bag had been her constant companion for 3 years of undercover work, a carefully chosen prop that suggested the practical sensibilities of a corrupt customs officer without appearing too expensive or suspicious. She'd carried it through dozens of meetings with criminals, each time knowing it contained secrets that could either save her life or end it. "Let's see what our little detective keeps in her personal arsenal," Torres growled, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a predator finally cornering wounded prey. He held the purse above the scarred wooden table with deliberate ceremony, savoring the moment of violation. The fluorescent light cast harsh shadows across his scarred knuckles as he prepared to empty its contents. Sarah forced herself to remain motionless in her chair, every muscle in her body coiled like a compressed spring. 3 years of deep cover work had taught her to control her micro-expressions, to hide fear and anticipation behind masks of resignation or defiance. But as Torres prepared to reveal the purse's contents, she felt something deeper than professional training taking control, the inherited instincts of a warrior's daughter, awakening after years of dormancy. The purse turned upside down with violent efficiency. Personal items scattered across the table in a cascade of ordinary deception lipstick in a shade too bright for her complexion, chosen to match Sofia Restrepo's fabricated vanity. A wallet containing fake credit cards and identification documents that had cost the FBI's forgery department months to perfect. Breath mints, a small notepad filled with coded observations, and a cheap ballpoint pen that doubled as a recording device. Carlos leaned forward with scientific interest, examining each item like an archaeologist studying artifacts from a vanquished civilization. "Very thorough," he murmured approvingly. "The attention to detail in your cover identity is quite impressive. I particularly appreciate the touch with the overdue bills authentic. Financial desperation is so difficult to fake convincingly." Then came the sound that changed everything. The metallic clang echoed through the room like a church bell, announcing Judgment Day. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. Every movement froze in place, as 6 pairs of eyes focused on the weapon that had slid across the wooden surface with the inexorable authority of destiny itself. The Desert Eagle .50 caliber pistol gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lighting, its gold plating catching and reflecting the light in ways that seemed almost supernatural. This wasn't the matte black finish of standard law enforcement weapons, or the utilitarian chrome of street criminals' guns. This was something else entirely, a weapon that commanded respect through craftsmanship and heritage rather than mere lethality. "Jesus Christ Almighty," whispered one of Carlos's lieutenants, his voice barely audible in the sudden silence. Professional criminals developed an instinct for recognizing danger, and every man in that room understood immediately that they were no longer looking at standard police equipment. This was a warrior's weapon, carried by someone with the training and temperament to use it effectively. Torres stumbled backward from the table, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. In his years of working for the Rodriguez cartel, he'd seen every type of weapon imaginable, from cheap Saturday night specials to military-grade assault rifles. But there was something about the Desert Eagle's presence that suggested violence on a scale he wasn't prepared for. The gold plating wasn't just decoration. It was a statement of identity, a declaration that whoever carried this weapon had earned the right to do so through blood and sacrifice. Carlos Rodriguez had built his criminal empire through an acute ability to read people and situations, to identify threats and opportunities with split-second accuracy. As he stared at the weapon, lying on his conference table, he felt the psychological balance of power shifting in ways he hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just a gun. It was a symbol of something larger, something connected to traditions and loyalties that ran deeper than criminal organizations or federal investigations. "That's not standard issue," Agent Chun observed unnecessarily, his voice tight with recognition of how dramatically the situation had changed. His 15 years with the FBI had taught him to recognize military weapons, and the Desert Eagle's specifications were burned into every federal agent's memory. 50 caliber Action Express ammunition, 15-inch barrel length, nearly 5 pounds of precision-engineered stopping power. This wasn't a weapon carried for convenience or concealment. It was carried to end confrontations definitively. Sarah slowly rose from her chair, her movements deliberate and controlled. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. The hunted becoming the hunter, the victim revealing herself as something far more dangerous than anyone in the room had anticipated. Her earlier fear and resignation fell away like discarded masks, replaced by the cold calculation of someone who'd been trained from childhood to face death without flinching. "That belonged to my father," she said quietly, her voice carrying a new authority that seemed to fill the room's corners and shadows. Each word was measured, weighted with meanings that went beyond simple explanation. She took a step toward the table, toward the weapon that represented her inheritance and her identity. The gold plating caught the light again as she moved, and for a moment, the Desert Eagle seemed less like an inanimate object and more like a living thing responding to its rightful owner's presence. The custom engraving along the barrel became visible, intricate scrollwork surrounding words that spoke of honor, duty, and sacrifice. This wasn't just a gun. It was a legacy made manifest in steel and precious metal. "Staff Sergeant Miguel Martinez," Sarah continued, her hand moving slowly but inevitably toward the weapon. "United States Army Special Forces. 3 tours of duty in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan." He carried this pistol through more firefights than most soldiers see in entire careers. Carlos found himself recalculating everything he thought he knew about the woman standing across from him, Detective Sarah Martinez was no longer just a federal agent who'd infiltrated his organization. She was the daughter of a decorated combat veteran, trained from childhood in the warrior traditions that had built and defended nations. The gold-plated Desert Eagle wasn't just her father's weapon. It was proof of a heritage that commanded respect in any room where violence was currency. The 6 men who'd seemed so confident moments earlier now shifted uncomfortably, their earlier predatory assurance replaced by the cautious wariness of predators who'd suddenly realized they might be facing an apex predator disguised as prey. Sarah's fingers wrapped around the familiar grip of the Desert Eagle, with the practiced ease of muscle memory forged in childhood. The weight distribution, the textured surface, the precise balance of the weapon, every detail was as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. She'd held this gun 1,000 times before, first as a curious child, learning firearm safety under her father's watchful eye, later as a teenager, discovering she had inherited not just his weapon, but his natural marksmanship abilities. Staff Sergeant Miguel Martinez, she repeated, her voice carrying the reverence reserved for fallen heroes. Green Beret, 5th Special Forces Group. He earned this weapon during his second tour in Kandahar province, when his unit held off a Taliban assault for 14 hours while waiting for extraction. The golden Desert Eagle remained pointed safely toward the floor, but every man in the room understood that its position could change in milliseconds if circumstances required. Carlos Rodriguez had encountered many dangerous people during his rise through the criminal underworld cartel enforcers, rival drug lords, corrupt officials who played both sides of the law for profit. But he'd never faced someone carrying the legacy of America's warrior elite, someone raised from childhood to view violence not as cruelty or intimidation, but as a sacred responsibility to protect the innocent and uphold justice. My father started teaching me to shoot when I was 8 years old, Sarah continued, her stance shifting almost imperceptibly into the modified weaver position that had been drilled into her through countless hours at firing ranges across 3 states. Every Saturday morning, rain or shine, we'd drive out to the desert range outside Barstow. He'd set up targets at progressively greater distances, teaching me not just marksmanship, but patience, discipline, respect for the weapons, power. Torres, a massive enforcer who'd seemed so intimidating moments earlier, found himself reassessing the tactical situation with growing unease. His experience with violence had always involved overwhelming physical advantages, size, numbers, surprise. But the woman standing across from him represented something entirely different. Precision training, combined with the calm confidence of someone who'd been raised to face death without flinching. By the time I was 12, I could put 6 rounds through a playing card at 50 yards, Sarah said, her eyes never leaving Carlos's face. My father would time me draw, acquire target, fire, under 2 seconds every time. He said that in combat, the difference between living and dying was often measured in fractions of a second. Agent Chun shifted nervously near the door, his betrayal of the Bureau now seeming like a catastrophic miscalculation. He'd fed information to Carlos about Sarah's background, but his files had focused on her police record, her undercover assignments, her psychological evaluations. Nothing in the FBI's personnel records had captured the depth of her military heritage or the extent of her combat training. When he deployed for his final tour in Afghanistan, he left the Desert Eagle with me, Sarah continued, the weapons, gold plating seeming to glow with its own internal light. I was 16, old enough to understand that he might not come back. He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I'd carry on the family tradition of service, not necessarily in the military, but somewhere in the fight between good and evil. The room's atmosphere had transformed completely from the theme predatory confidence of hunters surrounding prey to the tense uncertainty of criminals, realizing they'd awakened something far more dangerous than they'd anticipated. Sarah's revelation wasn't just about her father's military service, it was about a generational commitment to justice that ran deeper than any criminal organization's reach. 3 months later, Detective Ray Morrison called to tell me that my father had been killed, Sarah said, her voice hardening like steel tempered in fire. Not by enemy action in some heroic firefight, but by a single sniper's bullet while he was helping to distribute medical supplies to Afghan children in a supposedly secure village. Carlos found himself genuinely curious despite the tactical disadvantage he now faced. How does a war hero's daughter end up carrying his weapon into my meeting? Sarah smiled for the first time since entering the room, but there was no warmth in the expression, only the cold satisfaction of a hunter who'd successfully maneuvered her prey into the perfect position. Because 3 weeks after my father's funeral, Detective Morrison recruited me for a very special kind of police work. He said the country needed officers who understood that some fights couldn't be won through normal law enforcement procedures. The implications hung in the air like smoke from a distant battlefield. Sarah hadn't just stumbled into undercover work through career advancement or departmental assignment. She'd been specifically recruited by law enforcement officials who recognized that certain criminal organizations could only be defeated by officers willing to operate in the gray areas between legal and necessary. Morrison told me something that day that I've never forgotten. Sarah continued, her grip on the Desert Eagle shifting slightly as she prepared for whatever came next. He said that my father died fighting an enemy that used women and children as human shields that hid behind civilian populations while planning attacks on innocent people. He said that drug cartels operated the same way, corrupting communities, destroying families, using fear and intimidation to protect their operations from legitimate law enforcement. Torres glanced nervously toward the door, calculating distances and angles, but Sarah's positioning had been too carefully chosen. She commanded clear lines of sight to every person in the room while maintaining cover behind the heavy wooden table. Her father's training had included tactical positioning, as well as marksmanship lessons that were now saving her life in ways he could never have anticipated. So when the FBI offered me the chance to carry my father's fight into a different kind of war, Sarah concluded, I accepted. Not just as a police officer doing her job, but as Staff Sergeant Martinez's daughter, carrying on a tradition that started long before any of you decided that profit was more important than the communities you poison with your products. The Golden Desert Eagle remained pointed toward the floor, but every criminal in the room understood that they were no longer dealing with a trapped federal agent. They were facing a warrior's daughter who'd inherited not just her father's weapon, but his commitment to fighting evil wherever she found it, even if it meant dying in the process. The silence in Romano's back room stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. 6 hardened criminals found themselves frozen in a tableau of uncertainty, their earlier confidence evaporating as they processed the fundamental shift in power dynamics. The woman they'd planned to torture and kill had revealed herself as something far more dangerous than a trapped federal agent. She was a trained warrior carrying her father's legacy into battle. Carlos Rodriguez felt his carefully orchestrated plan beginning to unravel with each passing second. In 30 years of criminal operations, he'd learned to read people like open books, identifying their weaknesses and exploiting them with surgical precision. But Sarah Martinez represented a psychological profile he'd never encountered. Someone who viewed potential death not as ultimate defeat, but as an acceptable cost of completing her mission. Here's what's going to happen, Sarah announced, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to giving orders under fire. The Desert Eagle remained pointed safely downward, but her stance had shifted almost imperceptibly into a combat-ready position that would allow lightning-fast target acquisition if circumstances required it. She took a measured step away from her chair, positioning herself with clear lines of sight to every person in the room, while maintaining cover behind the heavy wooden table. The movement was so fluid, so professionally executed, that even Torres, despite his size and reputation for violence, found himself involuntarily stepping backward. "You're going to let me walk out of this room," Sarah continued, "and in exchange, I won't put 6.50 caliber rounds through your operation tonight." Her eyes swept across each man's face, cataloging their responses, identifying who might be foolish enough to test her resolve. "Because unlike you, I didn't come here alone." Carlos's blood chilled as the implications became clear. If Sarah Martinez wasn't the isolated, trapped victim they'd believed her to be, if this entire confrontation was part of a larger tactical operation, then everything they thought they knew about the situation was wrong. "That's impossible," Agent Chun interjected desperately, his voice cracking with the strain of maintaining his treacherous role. "I know the backup protocols. Your team thinks you're in a routine informant meeting. They won't expect contact for another hour." Sarah's smile was colder than winter wind across a battlefield graveyard. "David, you've been feeding information to Carlos for 2 years. Did you really think federal investigators wouldn't eventually notice patterns in compromised operations? Did you honestly believe that the Bureau's counterintelligence division wouldn't start looking for the source of leaked information?" The revelation hit the room like a physical shock wave. Agent Chun's face went pale as he realized the full scope of his exposure, while Carlos began calculating how many of his operations might be compromised if the FBI had been conducting their own counterintelligence operation all along. 3 months ago, Internal Affairs approached me with a very interesting proposition," Sarah continued, enjoying the psychological warfare after hours of being its target. "They'd identified you as a probable mole, David, but they needed proof that would stand up in federal court. So they created a special Operation 1 that would give you exactly the kind of high-value intelligence that would be irresistible to share with your criminal contacts." She reached behind her back with deliberate slowness, every eye in the thin room tracking her movement. But instead of a backup weapon, she withdrew a small electronic device that had been concealed beneath her jacket. The transmitter was barely larger than a smartphone, but its implications were enormous. "Say hello to the FBI surveillance team that's been listening to every word of this conversation," Sarah announced, pressing a button that activated a tiny red LED light. "They're currently positioned in a van 3 blocks away, recording everything for David's prosecution and your arrest warrants." The color drained from Carlos's face as he realized the magnitude of his miscalculation. This wasn't just about a blown undercover operation or a federal agent who'd gotten too close to his organization. This was an elaborate sting operation, designed to capture not just his cartel's leadership, but to expose the corruption that had been protecting his operations for years. "You're lying," Torres growled, his massive hands clenching into fists as he struggled to process the tactical reversal. "There's no surveillance team. We would have detected electronic equipment, radio signals, like you detected my father's." "Desert Eagle?" Sarah interrupted, her tone mocking. "Your counter-surveillance is impressive, but it's designed to catch routine federal operations. You weren't prepared for a joint task force that included military intelligence specialists who learned their trade hunting terrorists in Afghanistan and Iraq." Agent Chun made a desperate lunge toward the door, his guilty conscience finally overriding his survival instincts. But Sarah had anticipated the move, shifting her position to block his escape route while maintaining visual contact with the other threats in the room. "David, don't make this worse for yourself," she warned, though her attention remained focused primarily on Carlos and his armed lieutenants. "Your cooperation with this investigation might be the only thing standing between you and life in federal prison." Carlos Rodriguez had built his criminal empire through decisive action and calculated risk-taking. But the situation had deteriorated beyond any scenario his contingency plans had anticipated. If federal agents were indeed monitoring the conversation, then moving against Sarah would only provide additional evidence for their prosecutions. But allowing her to leave meant accepting the complete collapse of his organization and his freedom. "How long have they been listening?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's smile became genuinely predatory. "Since the moment I walked into this restaurant. Every threat you've made, every detail of your counterintelligence operation, every confession about corrupted federal agents, all of it recorded in high-definition audio that will sound very impressive to a federal jury." The golden desert eagle caught the fluorescent light as she adjusted her grip, and for the first time since entering the room, Sarah Martinez looked exactly like what she was. A warrior's daughter who'd inherited both his weapon and his commitment to seeing justice done, regardless of the personal cost. Outside Romano's restaurant, the night was about to become much more interesting for everyone involved. The sound of shattering glass erupted through Romano's restaurant like thunder, announcing the arrival of a violent storm. Windows exploded inward simultaneously from 3 different directions as FBI tactical teams breached the building with military precision. The darkened dining room below filled instantly with red laser dots dancing across walls and furniture, while the distinctive shouts of federal agents echoed up the stairwell like war cries. Carlos Rodriguez's survival instincts, honed through decades of violent criminal enterprise, finally overrode his shock at the elaborate deception he'd walked into. His hand moved toward the pistol, concealed beneath his expensive suit jacket, but froze as the golden desert eagle's barrel shifted with fluid precision to center on his chest. "I wouldn't," Sarah advised, her voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who'd made similar life-or-death calculations countless times. "That transmitter isn't just recording our conversation, it's also providing real-time tactical intelligence to the breach teams. They know exactly where everyone in this room is positioned, and they have authorization to use lethal force if you threaten a federal officer." The sound of combat boots pounding up the wooden staircase grew louder with each passing second. Heavy footsteps moved with the coordinated rhythm of tactical teams who'd rehearsed this operation dozens of times, who knew the building's layout from architectural drawings and had practiced every possible scenario in FBI training facilities. Torres, his earlier bravado completely evaporated, raised his massive hands in surrender as red laser dots appeared on his chest like glowing targets. "Don't shoot! I'm unarmed." His voice cracked with panic as he realized that his reputation for intimidation meant nothing to federal agents equipped with military-grade weapons and authorization to use them. "SRA, get down." The voice belonged to Special Agent Morrison, Sarah's handler and the architect of this elaborate sting operation. He appeared in the doorway with his tactical team, their black-clad forms looking like death itself as they swept into the room with weapons raised. But Sarah Martinez remained standing, the Desert Eagle still trained on Carlos Rodriguez with unwavering precision. Carlos was just explaining how he's been running counterintelligence operations against federal investigations, she announced calmly. "I thought you'd want to hear his confession before we conclude tonight's business." The room filled with federal agents, their movements choreographed with the precision of a military assault. Night vision goggles pushed up on their foreheads, revealed faces painted with tactical camouflage, while their body armor bore the distinctive yellow FBI letters that struck fear into criminals across the nation. Agent Shun made one final desperate attempt to escape his fate, lunging toward a window with the wild energy of a cornered animal. But 2 agents intercepted him before he'd taken 3 steps, driving him to the floor with professional efficiency, while reading him his rights through his panicked struggles. "David Shun, you're under arrest for conspiracy, treason, and violation of federal corruption statutes," Agent Morrison announced with obvious satisfaction. "You have the right to remain silent, though based on tonight's recordings, I suspect. Your lawyer will advise you to cooperate fully with federal prosecutors." Carlos Rodriguez found himself surrounded by the elite of American law enforcement, men and women who dedicated their careers to dismantling criminal organizations exactly like his. But his eyes remained fixed on Sarah Martinez and the weapon. That had transformed a certain victory into total defeat. "How long?" he asked, his voice carrying the weary resignation of a master strategist who'd been completely outmaneuvered. "How long have you been planning this operation?" Sarah finally lowered the Desert Eagle, though her finger remained alongside the trigger guard in textbook combat positioning. 18 months, she replied. "From the moment Internal Affairs identified patterns in compromised investigations, we knew someone with high-level access was feeding information to criminal organizations." Special Agent Morrison moved to stand beside Sarah, his tactical team maintaining their weapons trained on the remaining cartel members, while backup agents secured the building's perimeter. "The challenge wasn't catching the mole," he explained to Carlos with professional respect for a worthy adversary. "The challenge was building a case that would expose the full extent of your counterintelligence network." The implications were staggering. If the FBI had been conducting an 18-month investigation into compromised operations, then virtually every aspect of the Rodriguez cartel's protection network was now exposed. Bank accounts, corrupt officials, safe houses, transportation. Routes, all of it compromised by a single elaborate deception. "Miguel Santos never existed," Sarah continued, enjoying the psychological impact of her revelations on the criminal mastermind who'd orchestrated so many successful operations against law enforcement. Every meeting, every piece of intelligence he provided, every detail about federal investigations, all carefully crafted fiction, designed to make you comfortable enough to reveal your real operations. Carlos's lieutenants were systematically handcuffed and searched, their weapons confiscated as evidence, while FBI agents documented every aspect of the crime scene. The photographs that had seemed so damning earlier surveillance images of Sarah meeting with federal handlers were now revealed as carefully staged productions designed to reinforce his confidence in his counterintelligence capabilities. "The beautiful irony," Agent Morrison added, "is that your success in penetrating federal operations made you vulnerable to exactly this kind of deception. You were so confident in your ability to identify and neutralize law enforcement threats that you never considered the possibility that we were feeding you exactly the intelligence we wanted you to have." Torres and the other cartel members found themselves facing federal weapons charges, conspiracy indictments, and RICO prosecutions that would likely result in life sentences. But it was Carlos Rodriguez who faced the most comprehensive destruction, not just of his criminal empire, but of the sophisticated network of corruption and intimidation that had protected his operations for over a decade. As Sarah Martinez holstered her father's Desert Eagle, she realized that Staff Sergeant Miguel Martinez would have been proud of how his daughter had carried his warrior's legacy into a different kind of battlefield. The golden weapon had served its purpose not through violence, but through the psychological impact of inherited honor confronting criminal corruption. The night that had begun as Carlos Rodriguez's trap had ended as his complete and total defeat engineered by a veteran's daughter who'd proven that some legacies are stronger than any criminal organization. 18 months after the night that changed everything, Detective Sarah Martinez stood before the largest graduating class in the FBI Academy's history. The Quantico Auditorium was packed with fresh-faced agents who would soon carry their badges into America's most dangerous neighborhoods, pursuing criminals who threatened the fabric of civilized society. Behind her on the stage, displayed in a place of honor, sat the golden Desert Eagle that had become legendary within federal law enforcement circles. The weapon rested in a custom display case crafted from bulletproof glass, its gold plating catching the auditorium lights like captured sunlight. Engraved on the case's brass nameplate were words that had become a rallying cry for agents facing impossible odds. Staff Sergeant Miguel Martinez, Green Beret. His daughter carries the mission forward. Sarah had been promoted to assistant. Director of the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force, the youngest person in bureau history to hold such a position. The Rodriguez cartel case had become a textbook example of counterintelligence operations, studied in law enforcement academies worldwide. More importantly, it had led to the dismantling of corruption networks that had protected criminal organizations across 3 states. When I was 8 years old, Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's acoustic system, my father took me to a shooting range in the Mojave Desert. He handed me a .22 caliber rifle that seemed enormous in my small hands. And he taught me the first lesson that would shape the rest of my life. Respect the weapon, respect the training, but most importantly, respect the responsibility that comes with both. The audience of new agents listened with rapt attention. Many of them had heard versions of the Romano's restaurant story during their training, though the classified details remained known only to those with appropriate security clearances. What they understood was that the woman addressing them had faced down one of America's most sophisticated criminal organizations and emerged victorious through preparation, courage, and unwavering commitment to justice. My father served 3 tours in combat zones where the difference between protecting innocent lives and losing them was often measured in fractions of a second. Sarah continued, her gaze sweeping across the young faces before her. He taught me that a warrior's greatest weapon isn't the gun they carry, but the principles they refuse to compromise, even when compromising would be easier, safer, or more profitable. In the front row sat Agent Morrison, now Deputy Director of the FBI's Criminal Investigation Division. Beside him, Agent Chun's empty chair served as a stark reminder of the consequences of betraying those principles. David Chun was serving a 25-year sentence in federal prison, his law enforcement pension forfeited, his family destroyed by his greed and corruption. Carlos Rodriguez and his lieutenants had received life sentences without possibility of parole. Torres, the massive enforcer who'd seemed so intimidating in Romano's back room, had lasted exactly 6 weeks in federal prison before requesting protective custody. The criminal empire that had taken decades to build had collapsed in a single night, its assets seized, its corrupted officials exposed, its protection networks dismantled piece by piece. But perhaps the most important lesson my father taught me, Sarah said, her voice taking on a more personal tone, was that we don't serve for recognition, medals, or personal glory. We serve because someone has to stand between the innocent and those who would prey upon them. We serve because the alternative, allowing evil to flourish unchecked, is unacceptable to anyone who calls themselves a guardian of justice. Gestured toward the display case containing the Desert Eagle, its golden surface reflecting the faces of the graduating agents like a mirror of their own potential futures. This weapon has become a symbol within our organization, but not because of its stopping power or its monetary value. It's important because it represents a legacy of service that spans generations from combat zones in Afghanistan to the streets of American cities where children should be able to walk safely to school. The applause began slowly with Morrison and the other senior officials, then spread through the auditorium like a wave of appreciation for sacrifices both seen and unseen. Sarah raised her hand for silence, knowing her words weren't finished yet. 6 months ago, I received a letter from Maria Santos, a 12-year-old girl in East Los Angeles, she continued. Maria wrote to thank the FBI for removing the drug dealers from her neighborhood, dealers who were part of the Rodriguez cartel's distribution network. She said that for the first time in 3 years, she could walk to school without being afraid. Sarah's voice grew stronger, more passionate, as she delivered the heart of her message. That letter hangs on my office wall next to my father's. Purple Heart, because it reminds me every day why we do this work. Not for the headlines, not for the commendations, but for 12-year-old girls who deserve to grow up in communities where courage matters more than money, where right matters more than might. The graduating agents rose to their feet in sustained applause, understanding that they were witnessing something more than a graduation speech. They were receiving a commission to carry forward a tradition of service that reached back through generations of American warriors and guardians. When you leave here today, you'll carry badges that represent the hopes and dreams of every innocent person who looks to law enforcement for protection, Sarah concluded. Some of you will face situations where your training, your courage, and your commitment to justice are tested in ways you can't imagine. When those moments come, remember that you're part of something larger than any individual. You're part of a legacy that began long before any of us were born and will continue long after we're gone. As the ceremony concluded and new agents began their careers, Sarah Martinez touched the glass case containing her father's weapon one final time. Staff Sergeant Miguel Martinez had carried the Desert Eagle through foreign battlefields in service of American ideals. His daughter had carried it into domestic battles against enemies who threatened those same ideals from within. The golden gun would remain at Quantico, inspiring future generations of federal agents to remember that some battles are worth fighting regardless of the personal cost, and that the true legacy of any warrior isn't the weapons they carry, but the principles they defend and the innocent lives they protect. In conference rooms and classrooms across America, the story of the night when a golden Desert Eagle silenced a room full of criminals would be told and retold, each telling reinforcing the fundamental truth that courage, preparation, and unwavering commitment to justice remain humanity's most powerful weapons against those who would prey upon the innocent. The legacy of steel lived on.